Before dawn on a quiet winter morning, gunfire shattered the silence of a New Zealand farm. A young father lay dead at his own gate, and the truth of who pulled the trigger has haunted a nation ever since. The winter morning of July 8, 2010, broke in darkness over the quiet farmland near Feilding, a town nestled in New Zealand's Manawatu region. Life in this part of the country had always moved at the pace of the seasons. Cows to be milked before dawn, paddocks shifting from green to mud, families rising early to keep farms alive. But on this day, that rhythm was shattered by the echo of gunfire, the kind of violence that feels foreign to the serenity of rural life. Scott Guy, a 31-year-old farmer, husband, and father, began his day in the way countless dairy farmers do. He rose before the first hints of light touched the sky, checked his computer briefly, and made himself a coffee before stepping into the cold. His silver Hilux Uda rumbled down the driveway, headlights cutting through mist. But at the gate, the same gate that usually stood open, Scott had to stop. The heavy metal barriers had been closed by someone, forcing him out of the vehicle. In the pale glow of his headlights, Scott moved to lift the stubborn gate. The air was damp, the gravel wet underfoot, the kind of silence that makes the world feel paused. Then, out of the darkness, a figure stepped forward. A shotgun was raised. In a heartbeat, 2 blasts rang out, tearing through the stillness of the countryside. Scott collapsed onto the gravel, his cap torn, his body spread in the dirt as blood seeped into the soil. The Uda's headlights continued to beam, its engine idling, as if time itself had stopped. Hours later, it was not family but a neighbor who stumbled upon the scene. David Barry, a truck driver heading to work, noticed the unnatural glare of headlights fixed on the road. Curious, he slowed, and what he saw stopped him cold. The unmistakable shape of a man sprawled at the gate. He slammed on the brakes, rushed out, and found Scott lying lifeless. The sight was gruesome. A gaping wound to the throat, blood pooled across the driveway. Barry's frantic call to emergency services described what he thought was a brutal knife attack. But investigators would later confirm the truth. Scott had been shot at close range, his injuries so catastrophic that survival would have been impossible. When police arrived, the farm suddenly became a crime scene. Constables in the early light tried to make sense of what they saw. A farmer cut down in his driveway, no sign of a weapon, no clear trace of the killer. His Uda remained running, his wallet still inside, his morning coffee cup waiting back in the kitchen. Nothing had been stolen. This was no robbery gone wrong. Whoever had stood in the shadows waiting for him hadn't wanted his belongings. They had wanted him dead. As word spread, the Guy family's world collapsed. Scott's wife, Kylie, was 7 months pregnant with their second child. She opened her door to armed police telling her there had been an accident, but deep down she already knew the truth. Her 2-year-old son, Hunter, clung to her as she sobbed, the sound of sirens and radios outside a cruel backdrop to the breaking of her world. Scott's father, Brian, raced to the farm, his heart clinging to the hope that it was all a mistake. But when he was stopped at a police cordon and told his son had been murdered, the reality struck with the kind of force no parent is ever prepared for. His mother, Jo, arrived soon after, desperate to see her son, but the police held her back. The body of her boy lay just beyond the gate, shielded by crime scene tape, while she stood powerless, repeating the words no mother should ever have to say, "Not my baby, not Scotty." The news spread like wildfire through Feilding and beyond. A young father, popular and well-regarded, shot dead at his own gate. The murder of Scott Guy wasn't just shocking. It was incomprehensible. Who would want him dead? Why here, in the heart of dairy country, where disputes were usually solved over a handshake, not a shotgun? Detectives quickly realized this was not going to be a straightforward case. There were no eyewitnesses, no weapon, no clear motive. But what they did find raised chilling possibilities. Footprints, distinct wavy-patterned impressions, led away from Scott's body. They seemed to belong to dive boots, an unusual choice for farm work. Even more curious, those same prints appeared near an old cowshed where Scott and Kylie kept a litter of Labrador puppies. And when investigators checked the shed, they discovered 3 puppies were missing. Had Scott surprised a thief? Had someone come to steal the pups and silenced him when caught? The theory seemed plausible, but it didn't explain the ferocity of the attack. 2 close-range shotgun blasts spoke of more than panic. They spoke of intention. Whoever pulled that trigger had meant for Scott Guy to die. Forensic scientists pieced together the trajectory of the shots. The first blast struck Scott in the throat, catastrophic and instantly incapacitating. The second tore into his face and arm as he fell, suggesting the killer had fired again to ensure there was no chance of survival. This was not the clumsy act of a startled burglar. It was a deliberate execution. As the investigation began, detectives widened their focus. Who was Scott Guy? Did he have enemies? Was there something hidden beneath the surface of his life? What they found painted a picture far from the portrait of a man involved in shady dealings. Scott was well-liked, a devoted husband and father, and someone described by friends as loyal and kind-hearted. He had no known debts, no enemies worth killing for. But the Guy family had not been untouched by hostility. 2 years earlier, the old farmhouse Scott planned to move had been deliberately set on fire. Then, as Scott and Kylie built their new home, the nearly completed house had been vandalized in a frenzy of destruction. Windows smashed, pipes torn out, walls spray-painted with vile graffiti calling Kylie a whore. The attacks had never been solved. Now, in the wake of Scott's murder, detectives wondered if they were all connected. As the hours turned into days, the farm filled with white-suited forensic teams, tents erected over the body and the UDA, officers combing the ground inch by inch. They took plaster casts of every footprint, swabbed every surface, traced every tire mark. Scott's body was taken for post-mortem, where pathologists confirmed what was already clear. This was no accident, no mistake, but a close-range shooting carried out with deadly precision. Meanwhile, Kylie was left to pick up the fragments of a life destroyed. 7 months pregnant, she clutched her wedding ring from Scott's dresser and faced a future without the man she had planned everything with. Their unborn son would never know his father's voice, never ride alongside him on the farm bike, never hear his cowboy songs on the guitar. The weight of that absence hung over the family with crushing heaviness. The community of Feilding, proud of its rural roots, was left reeling. Farmers who had always left their gates open and trusted their neighbors now felt the shadow of fear. Who had walked those fields with a shotgun that morning? Was the killer still among them? And why had Scott Guy been targeted with such violent finality? The answers would not come quickly. Instead, the investigation that followed would unravel secrets, reveal rivalries, and expose the darker currents flowing beneath the surface of farm life. For this was not just the story of a murder. It was the story of a family split by suspicion, of loyalty tested in the harshest way, and of a nation gripped by a question that still lingers years later. Who killed Scott Guy? The day after Scott Guy's body was discovered, the quiet of Aorangi Road was broken by a procession of police vehicles, journalists, and neighbors driving slowly past, craning their necks to glimpse the farm that had suddenly become the focus. The murder of a young father is always shocking, but this one seemed especially cruel, even senseless. Scott had not lived in the dangerous underworld of drugs or gangs. He had no criminal record, no debts, no violent enemies. He was the archetype of a rural New Zealand farmer, hardworking, family-focused, a man more likely to spend his evenings playing guitar for his wife or tossing a rugby ball with friends than picking fights, which left police with a terrible puzzle. Why would anyone lie in wait to ambush him in the dark? Detective Inspector Sue Schwalger, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for tenacity, took charge of the inquiry. For her and her team, the task ahead was daunting. No murder weapon had been found. There were no eyewitnesses, no CCTV cameras in the middle of the countryside, no clear suspects. The only real clue lay in the mud. Those unusual footprints with their wavy sole pattern, pressed into the soil near Scott's body and by the shed where the puppies were kept. From the beginning, the police were under pressure. Media headlines screamed, "Farmer executed at gate," and "Who would kill Scott Guy?" Talkback radio filled with speculation, and the people of Feilding whispered about the possible motives. Within hours, theories spread like wildfire. Some pointed to the stolen puppies. Could the killer have been a thief caught in the act? It seemed possible, but the brutality of the attack didn't fit with a panicked burglar. Others wondered about jealousy or affairs, but friends and family were adamant. Scott and Kylie's marriage was strong, their love genuine. No whispers of infidelity, no hidden secrets. Then came another theory, one that seemed to fit the narrative of rural crime. Perhaps Scott had stumbled upon a cannabis operation on the farm, or confronted someone using their land to grow drugs. But intensive searches by police, even aerial sweeps, turned up nothing more than the odd stray seedling by the riverbank. Drugs, it seemed, were a dead end. The most unsettling possibility, however, came from the family's own past. This was not the first time the guys had been targeted. 2 years earlier, their old farmhouse, the one Scott had planned to shift for renovation, had been burned to the ground in a suspicious fire. The following year, just as the new home for Scott and Kylie neared completion, it had been ransacked and vandalized. Doors smashed, pipes ripped out, windows shattered, and on the walls, in crude brown paint, vile words aimed at Kylie. "Fucking whore." Whoever had done it wanted to send a message, personal, nasty, and unmistakably threatening. At the time, Scott had been so angry he bought a shotgun for protection. He even kept it hidden in his Uda, ready in case the vandals came back. But they never caught the culprits, and eventually life moved on. Until now, in the wake of Scott's murder, those unsolved attacks took on chilling new significance. As detectives pieced through the wreckage of Scott's life, they also tried to keep the Guy family shielded from the relentless intrusion of grief, mixed with suspicion. Kylie, 7 months pregnant, stayed with her in-laws. Her 2-year-old son, Hunter, tugged at her sleeve, asking when his dad would come home. She had no answer, only tears. Meanwhile, Scott's parents, Brian and Joe, tried to comfort their children while reeling from their own devastation. The funeral became a moment of heartbreak and defiance. More than 1,000 people filled the church in Feilding, cowboy hats and farm boots in the pews, as Scott's coffin arrived on the back of his own Uda. Friends from Australia, his fellow jackaroos, cracked whips in his honor. His family, including his brother-in-law Ewen Macdonald, carried the coffin on their shoulders. Scott's dog sat forlornly in the back of the Uda, tail still, eyes searching. For the community, the funeral was a reminder of just how many lives Scott had touched. For police, it was a reminder of the scale of expectation. Killer was out there. Family was broken. A town was frightened. And the longer the investigation dragged on without an arrest, the louder the whispers would grow. Back on the farm, investigators cataloged every detail. They took more than 60 plaster casts of the mysterious boot prints. They photographed the shotgun wads found near the body and by the fence, evidence of at least 2 blasts. They noted how the gates had been deliberately shut, ensuring Scott had to stop and get out of his Uda. This was not random, they concluded. It was planned. Someone had laid a trap in the dark, waited for him, and pulled the trigger. Theories continued to swirl. A crime of passion? A dispute over land or money? A family feud? To outsiders, the Guy family seemed close, bound by blood and farming tradition. But as police began to dig deeper, they heard murmurings of tension, of disagreements about the future of the farm, of personalities clashing in the milking shed. At first, no one wanted to believe it, but slowly, suspicion began to shift closer to home. At this stage, though, the investigation was wide open. Police knocked on doors, interviewed neighbors, tracked down leads about strangers seen in the area. Every rural burglary, every scrap of gossip was checked. Psychics even phoned in visions. One claimed to see Scott standing near a blue and white sedan, calling out for help. None of it panned out. 6 months after the murder, the case seemed no closer to being solved. Detectives had roadblocks, flyers, hours of interviews, but no arrests. The public was restless. The family was desperate. And the investigators faced a gnawing reality. Unless they found something soon, Scott Guy's murder might become one more unsolved crime on the list of New Zealand's mysteries. But in the new year, everything changed. Because when police looked back at those earlier attacks, the fire, the vandalism, the threatening notes, a new name began to surface. A name uncomfortably close to the heart of the family. The name was Ewen Macdonald. The new year brought no fresh comfort to the Guy family. Summer lay over the Manawatu, but the shadow of Scott's unsolved murder lingered heavy. Months had passed, yet the killer had not been found. The police investigation, codenamed Operation Yellow, had shrunk from more than 40 detectives to fewer than 15. Leads had dried up, and for many, hope that the case would be solved seemed to be fading. But the detectives who remained refused to give up. They went back to the beginning, retracing every thread, re-examining every piece of evidence. And when they looked again at the earlier attacks on Scott and Kylie's property, the fire that destroyed the old house, the graffiti and destruction of their new home, they began to wonder, were these not random acts of malice, but stepping stones leading to the murder itself? When photos of the obscene graffiti were re-released to the public, something remarkable happened. A local building contractor recognized the handwriting. It looked eerily similar to that of one of his former apprentices, a young man named Callum Bow. Bow was no stranger to the Guys. He'd worked on the family farm as a teenager and had been close friends with Scott's brother-in-law, Ewen Macdonald. Police brought Bow in for questioning. At first, he denied involvement, but under pressure, cracks appeared. Slowly, a darker picture began to form. Bow admitted that he and Ewen had been behind the vandalism of Scott and Kylie's house. They had crept there in the night, armed with axes and paint, and wrecked the nearly finished home. Ewen had been the instigator, Bow claimed, and together they carried out the destruction. For investigators, this was a seismic revelation. Until now, Ewen Macdonald had been seen as one of the grieving family, a victim alongside the rest. He had married Scott's sister, Anna. He lived on the family farm. He was trusted, respected, and had even carried Scott's coffin at the funeral. But suddenly, the man who had wept with the family, the more police dug, the more disturbing details emerged. Ewen Macdonald, it turned out, had been living a kind of double existence. By day, he was the hard-working farm manager, father of 4, reliable and steady. But by night, he indulged in acts of destruction and revenge. He had burned down an old house. He had taken an axe to property. He had slaughtered calves with a hammer during disputes with neighbors. These weren't just childish pranks. They were calculated, cruel acts that revealed a man capable of shocking violence. Now, police had to ask the question everyone dreaded. If Ewen Macdonald could burn, smash, and kill in secret, could he also have pulled the trigger on Scott? The motive was there, at least in part. Beneath the surface, tensions between Scott and Ewen had been simmering for years. Both men worked the Guy family farm, but their visions for its future clashed. Scott was ambitious, eager to expand, full of ideas for growth. Ewen, though outwardly cooperative, was increasingly resentful. He confided to friends that he felt pushed aside, overshadowed, even humiliated by his younger brother-in-law. To the outside world, they were partners. In private, their relationship was fraying. The possibility that Ewen might have killed Scott tore at the heart of the Guy family. Anna, his wife, refused to believe it. To her, Ewen was a devoted husband, a loving father, someone incapable of murder. How could the man she'd known since her teenage years, the father of her 4 children, be the same man police now painted as a secret saboteur? But investigators couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Those wavy boot prints at the crime scene, they were consistent with dive boots Ewen owned. The lies about his whereabouts on the nights of the arson and vandalism, exposed. His friendship with Bow, a link to the very crimes that had foreshadowed Scott's death. And the growing picture of a man with a hidden capacity for violence, undeniable. As the walls closed in, Ewen Macdonald's mask began to slip. He admitted to the acts of vandalism. He admitted to setting fires, to smashing property, to destroying things that weren't his. But on the ultimate question, the murder of Scott Guy, he remained adamant. He had nothing to do with it. For police, this was the turning point. The investigation, once wide and sprawling, now began to narrow its gaze. No longer was the killer an anonymous stranger in the night. He had a name. He had a face. He was part of the very family that grieved at Scott's funeral. By early 2011, detectives were preparing their case. And when they finally made their move, the country would be stunned. The man accused of murdering Scott Guy, the young farmer loved by his community, was none other than his own brother-in-law, Ewen Macdonald. But this arrest would not bring resolution. Instead, it would ignite one of the most sensational trials New Zealand had ever seen. A courtroom drama where every detail of farm life, family loyalty, and hidden betrayal would be laid bare. And as the public would soon discover, the truth was far murkier than anyone had imagined. The arrest came in April 2011, nearly a year after Scott Guy was murdered. By then, the country had followed every twist of the investigation, waiting for a breakthrough. Rumors had swirled endlessly, of puppy thieves, drug growers, strangers on the road. But when detectives finally made their move, the name that appeared in headlines was one that stunned everyone: Ewen Macdonald. To the public, Macdonald had been the grieving brother-in-law, the man who had worked side by side with Scott, carried his coffin, comforted his widow, and cried at the graveside. He was a father of 4, a husband to Anna, Scott's youngest sister. To suggest that he, of all people, was capable of murder felt almost unthinkable. Yet police were convinced they had found their suspect. Behind the scenes, detectives had been carefully stacking pieces of a puzzle. They had Callum Bow's confession, tying Macdonald to the acts of arson and vandalism against Scott and Kylie's property. They had evidence of his secret nighttime exploits, the calf killings, the property damage, the violence done under the cover of darkness. They had those distinctive wavy-soled boot prints, so similar to the dive boots Macdonald owned. And they had a motive, rooted in resentment over the farm, a clash of visions, and a bitterness that had quietly grown into rage. For police, the narrative was clear. Macdonald had seen his brother-in-law as a rival, someone threatening his role on the farm and in the family. And in the pre-dawn hours of July 8, 2010, he had laid a trap, closing the gates, waiting in the dark, and pulling the trigger. But the case was never going to be that simple. When news of Macdonald's arrest broke, the Guy family was torn apart. Brian and Joe, still grieving the loss of their son, now faced the possibility that their son-in-law, the man married to their daughter, was accused of being the killer. Anna stood by her husband, fiercely loyal, unable to believe that the man she had loved since she was a teenager was capable of such a crime. She insisted Ewen was innocent, that he was being made a scapegoat. For Kylie, the pain was almost unbearable. She had lost her husband, was raising 2 boys without him, and now had to process the fact that the man accused of killing Scott was not a stranger, not some faceless intruder, but a member of her own family. The wider community was just as divided. Some saw the evidence, the hidden acts of violence, the lies, the resentment, and believed the police had their man. Others, especially those who knew Macdonald personally, struggled to reconcile the family man they recognized with the picture painted by investigators. Was he a cold-blooded killer, or a scapegoat caught up in a storm of suspicion? As Macdonald stood in court for the first time, charged with murder, the contrast was striking. He looked calm, almost detached, dressed neatly, answering questions with quiet precision. He denied the charge. His lawyer hinted that the evidence was circumstantial, that police were weaving a story rather than proving a crime. Meanwhile, the media swarmed. The case became front-page news, dominating nightly broadcasts. New Zealanders watched as the intimate details of the Guy family's life spilled into the public arena. The story had all the elements that gripped a nation: murder, betrayal, family feuds, secrets, and the looming drama of a trial. But beyond the sensational headlines, detectives still faced a difficult truth. They had no murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession. What they had was a man with a disturbing history of secret crimes and a motive born of bitterness. Whether that would be enough to convince a jury remained uncertain. As the months passed, preparations for the trial intensified. Police compiled thousands of pages of evidence. Forensic experts prepared to testify about boot prints, shotgun wads, and timelines. Witnesses were called, from farmhands to family members, each with their own perspective on the complicated relationships within the Guy family. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic courtroom battles in New Zealand's history. It would pit the state against a man who had once been seen as the heart of the family. It would force the Guy family to sit in a courtroom and relive the worst day of their lives. And it would leave an entire country divided over guilt, innocence, and the nature of justice. As winter of 2012 approached, the trial of Ewen Macdonald was about to begin. And with it, the story of Scott Guy's murder would shift from the fields of Feilding to the charged atmosphere of a courtroom. A place where every secret, every betrayal, and every doubt would be laid bare. The trial of Ewen Macdonald began in June 2012, almost 2 years after Scott Guy's death. By the time the jury was sworn in, the case had already consumed the nation. Newspapers carried daily updates, talkback radio debated guilt and innocence, and TV bulletins treated the courtroom as theater. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone seemed certain they knew the truth. But inside the Palmerston North High Court, it was the jury, 11 ordinary citizens, who would be asked to decide whether a husband, father, and brother-in-law was also a killer. From the very first day, the stakes were clear. On one side, the Crown prosecutors painted a picture of a man consumed by resentment. They told the jury that Ewen Macdonald had secretly despised Scott, that their partnership on the farm had been poisoned by rivalry and jealousy. Scott, they said, had big plans for the farm, plans that threatened to sideline Ewen. And on that cold July morning, unable to contain his bitterness any longer, Macdonald ambushed Scott at the gates and shot him dead. To support this theory, the prosecution laid out a trail of evidence. The boot prints with the wavy sole, matching dive boots linked to Ewen. The history of arson and vandalism, proving he was capable of calculated acts of destruction. The timeline of the morning, which, they argued, left him enough time to leave the milking shed, commit the murder, and return unnoticed. Piece by piece, they wove a story of betrayal and violence. But the defense, led by the formidable Greg King, had an entirely different narrative. King was one of New Zealand's most skilled defense lawyers, known for his commanding presence and ability to dismantle the opposition's case. From the start, he told the jury the prosecution's theory was built on sand. Yes, Ewen had committed crimes of vandalism, arson, and cruelty. He admitted those shameful acts. But murder, that was a line he had never crossed. The defense highlighted what the police didn't have. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession, no forensic evidence tying Macdonald directly to the shooting. The boot prints, King argued, could belong to any number of people. The timeline, he insisted, was far tighter than the prosecution suggested. Far too tight for Macdonald to have left the shed, carried out the killing, and returned in time. The Crown, he said, was asking the jury to make a leap of faith, to convict a man on suspicion rather than certainty. As the weeks unfolded, witness after witness took the stand. Neighbors described hearing farm bikes in the early morning darkness. Forensic experts explained the trajectories of shotgun pellets, the meaning of the wads found at the scene. Farmhands were questioned about the relationship between Scott and Ewen, whether tension on the farm had reached breaking point. Perhaps most powerfully, members of the Guy family appeared before the court. Kylie, widowed and still grieving, told the jury about the night before the murder. How Scott had tucked their son into bed. How he had been looking forward to the birth of their second child. Her voice shook as she spoke of waking to the sound of sirens, of holding Hunter as police told her there had been an accident. The courtroom was silent as she described realizing she would never again see her husband walk through the door. Other family members spoke too. Brian and Joe, the parents who had raised their son on the farm, recounted the morning they learned he was gone. Their pain was evident, but so too was the torment of sitting only meters from their son-in-law, the man accused of causing it all. Throughout it, Macdonald sat quietly in the dock. He showed little emotion, occasionally jotting notes or glancing toward his lawyers. To some, his composure seemed cold. To others, it was simply the demeanor of a man trying to hold himself together under unbearable scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy continued. Every word spoken inside was dissected on evening news broadcasts. Coffee shops and workplaces buzzed with speculation. Was Ewen a calculating murderer hiding behind a mask of normality? Or was he a flawed man being unjustly accused of the most serious crime of all? As the prosecution presented its case, the jury listened carefully. But when the defense began its counterattack, the cracks in the Crown's narrative became more apparent. Greg King's cross-examinations were devastating. He challenged the reliability of the timeline. He pressed forensic experts on the uncertainty of their conclusions. He suggested alternative possibilities, that the killer could have been a stranger, a burglar, someone with a grudge against the family that had nothing to do with Macdonald. Day after day, the trial became a battle not just of facts, but of persuasion. The Crown insisted the case was clear. Motive means opportunity. The defense insisted it was built on speculation and coincidence. And in the middle sat the jury, tasked with sorting through a mountain of evidence, contradiction, and emotion. By the time the trial neared its end, the nation was gripped. Families sat around televisions each night, absorbing every detail. The question who killed Scott Guy wasn't just a headline anymore, it was a national obsession. And as the final days of testimony drew near, one thing became clear. The verdict, whatever it would be, was destined to divide the country. Inside the Palmerston North High Court, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. The prosecution had laid out its version of events. A brother-in-law, consumed by jealousy and resentment, lured Scott Guy to his death and executed him at the farm gate. It was a tidy story, one that seemed to stitch the fragments of evidence into a convincing whole. But trials are not only about stories told by prosecutors, they are about the relentless testing of those stories. And in this trial, that task fell to defense lawyer Greg King. King had already built a reputation as one of the most formidable courtroom advocates in New Zealand. He was charismatic, sharp, and unafraid of confrontation. His strategy was clear. Dismantle the Crown's case piece by piece, show the jury that what looked solid was, in fact, riddled with uncertainty. He began with the footprints. The Crown claimed the wavy-patterned sole prints in the driveway matched dive boots owned by Macdonald. But under King's questioning, forensic experts were forced to admit that the prints could not be conclusively tied to him. Many brands used similar sole patterns. Dive boots were sold in sports stores across the country. No DNA or unique identifier linked the prints to Macdonald specifically. What the prosecution had painted as damning evidence, King reframed as circumstantial at best. Next came the timeline. The Crown suggested Macdonald left the milking shed early, crept down to Scott's driveway, committed the murder, and returned before anyone noticed. But King pressed witnesses on the timing of events. Farm workers testified that Ewen had been with them around the crucial moments. Phone records showed texts and calls. The window of opportunity, King argued, was razor-thin, too tight to fit the Crown's theory unless Macdonald moved with impossible precision. He then turned to the issue of motive. Yes, there had been tensions between Scott and Ewen. Yes, they had disagreed about the farm's future. But as King reminded the jury, family disagreements were common in farming life. Were they enough to turn a father of four into a killer? King suggested the prosecution was asking the jury to believe that ordinary frustrations had escalated into murder, without any direct evidence that Macdonald ever planned or threatened such a thing. Perhaps King's most powerful tactic was to remind the jury, again and again, of what the Crown did not have. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession, no direct forensic link. In a murder case, King argued those absences mattered more than anything else. Suspicion, he told the jury, is not proof. The cross-examinations grew tense. Forensic scientists bristled under King's rapid-fire questions. Police investigators were challenged on their assumptions, their handling of evidence, the mysterious discovery of a second shotgun wad days after the first. King suggested errors, oversights, even the possibility of contamination. His message was clear. The Crown's narrative was not airtight, and where there is doubt, there must be acquittal. Through it all, Macdonald sat quietly, watching his lawyer take apart the case. His calm demeanor frustrated some observers, who saw in it a chilling detachment. Others believed it was simply the restraint of a man whose fate rested in the hands of strangers. Meanwhile, the Guy family endured the ordeal with quiet anguish. Kylie, still grieving, listened as her husband's life was dissected and debated in public. Brian and Joe watched as the son-in-law they had once trusted was defended as though he were a victim himself. Anna, torn between loyalty to her brother and her husband, continued to support Ewen, insisting the crown was wrong. Outside the court, public opinion fractured further. Some were convinced Macdonald was guilty. The secret vandalism, the calf killings, the resentment toward Scott, all pointed to a man capable of far worse. Others believed he was being persecuted, that police had zeroed in on him because they had no one else. On talkback shows and in cafes, the debate raged daily. Was Ewen a murderer or a scapegoat? By the time the defense rested its case, the jury had heard weeks of evidence, thousands of words of testimony, and hours of argument. What remained was uncertainty, and uncertainty, Greg King reminded them, was enough for reasonable doubt. The trial now moved toward its climax. Closing arguments, the judge's directions, and the moment the jury would be sent to deliberate on the question that had haunted the country for 2 years. Did Ewen Macdonald murder Scott Guy? Or had the Crown failed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt? The answer lay just ahead, behind the heavy doors of the jury room. The trial of Ewen Macdonald had lasted weeks. The jury had listened to farmers and scientists, family members and police officers. They had sat through hours of testimony, diagrams, photographs, and arguments. But as June 2012 drew to a close, the case moved to its most decisive moment. The final words of the lawyers. The Crown stood first. Prosecutors knew their evidence had weaknesses. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no confession. But they urged the jury to look at the bigger picture. They reminded them of the boot prints, the arson, the vandalism, the bitter undercurrent between Scott and Ewen. They argued this was not coincidence but a pattern. A man with a secret history of destruction escalating to the ultimate act of violence. "Look at the gates," the prosecutor said. "Someone closed them to force Scott to stop. Look at the shotgun wads, the footprints, the timeline. All of it points to one man, the man sitting before you." They told the jury that while no one had seen Macdonald pull the trigger, the weight of circumstantial evidence left no other reasonable explanation. Then came the defense. Greg King rose with the confidence of a man who knew this was his stage. For hours, he spoke directly to the jury, weaving together everything he had chipped away at during cross-examination. His voice carried not just reason but passion. "Suspicion," he told them, "is not proof. It never has been, and it never will be." He held up the Crown's case as a fragile structure, built on assumptions and conjecture. Yes, Macdonald had done terrible things, the vandalism, the arson, the cruelty to animals. No one disputed that. But those acts, King insisted, were not murder. To leap from mischief and malice to calculated execution was too great a jump. He dismantled the timeline again, showing how impossibly tight it was. He reminded the jury that dive boots were common, that the boot prints could belong to someone else entirely. He pointed to the mysterious discovery of the second shotgun wad, found days later, asking how jurors could be sure the crime scene had been handled properly. And then he turned to motive. Family tensions, he argued, were part of farm life everywhere. Disagreement, he told the jury, is not a death sentence. Resentment is not a motive for murder. To convict this man, you need more, much more. King's voice rose as he made his final appeal. This case is not about whether you like Ewen Macdonald. It is not about whether you approve of his behavior in the past. It is about whether the Crown has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that he murdered Scott Guy. And ladies and gentlemen, they have not. When he sat down, the courtroom was silent. Even those who had heard every word of the trial felt the weight of what was coming next. The judge, Justice Simon France, then addressed the jury. He reminded them of their duty, to decide only on the evidence, to separate rumor from fact, to put aside emotion. He explained the law of murder, the meaning of beyond reasonable doubt, and the burden of proof that lay entirely on the Crown. And then, at last, the jury was sent out to deliberate. 11 ordinary people, farmers, workers, parents, carried the weight of a nation's attention into the quiet of the jury room. Outside, the world waited. For the Guy family, the hours stretched painfully. Brian and Joe sat with their grief, torn between love for their murdered son and loyalty to their daughter Anna, whose husband's future now hung in the balance. Kylie, still raising 2 boys without Scott, braced herself for an answer that could never bring her husband back. Anna, standing by Ewen, prayed the jury would see what she believed, that he was innocent. New Zealand itself seemed to pause. Radios played updates. News bulletins speculated. Conversations across the country returned, again and again, to the same question. Was Ewen Macdonald guilty of murder, or had the Crown failed to prove its case? The jury deliberated hour after hour, day after day. Each knock on the courtroom door, each whisper from the court staff, brought the possibility that a verdict had been reached. And finally, after tense days of waiting, the signal came. The jury had made its decision. The courtroom filled once more. The Guy family sat in the front rows, eyes fixed on the jury box. Macdonald stood in the dock, expression unreadable. The 4-person rows, verdict slip in hand. After nearly 2 years of suspicion, pain, and speculation, the moment had come. The jury was ready to speak. The jury had deliberated for 5 days. 5 days of weighing footprints against timelines, emotion against evidence, suspicion against certainty. And now, as the clock ticked on July 3, 2012, they filed back into the courtroom. The air was electric. The Guy family sat in silence, bracing for words that could never undo the past, but might at least deliver justice. Kylie clutched a tissue in her hand, her eyes fixed on the jury. Brian and Joe leaned forward in their seats. Anna sat apart, her gaze steady, her husband's fate seconds from being sealed. In the dock, Ewen Macdonald stood, shoulders square, face calm. If he felt fear, he hid it well. The court registrar asked the jury 4-person for their decision. A hush fell so deep that every creak of the wooden benches seemed amplified. The 4-person spoke clearly. On the charge of murder, we find the accused not guilty. The words hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some wept. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Macdonald exhaled slowly, his face betraying only the slightest flicker of relief. He had been acquitted. But for the Guy family, the verdict landed like a hammer. Kylie wept openly, shaking her head. She had sat through weeks of evidence, listening to the Crown describe how her husband was gunned down, and believed the man responsible. Brian and Joe Guy were stoic, but devastated. They had lost their son, endured 2 years of anguish, and now faced the possibility that his killer might never be found. Anna clung to the verdict as vindication of her husband's innocence. But the family bond, once unbreakable, now strained under the weight of division. Outside the courthouse, crowds and cameras swarmed. Reporters relayed the verdict across the country. Talkback radio lines lit up within minutes. Some callers declared it justice, saying the Crown had never proved its case. Others called it a travesty, insisting the jury had been misled, that a guilty man had walked free. The country was split, not just in opinion but in emotion. The acquittal did not mean Macdonald was free from consequences. Even before the verdict, he had pleaded guilty to charges of arson, vandalism, and killing calves, the secret crimes unearthed during the investigation. For those acts, he would face sentencing later. But for the murder of Scott Guy, he walked away acquitted, his name legally cleared of the charge that had defined him for 2 years. For the police, the verdict was a bitter blow. They had poured thousands of hours into the investigation, followed leads across the country, put a man on trial. And yet, in the end, it wasn't enough. Operation Yellow had ended not with a conviction, but with unanswered questions. And the biggest question of all still echoed through every home, every cafe, every farm shed in New Zealand. If not Ewen Macdonald, then who killed Scott Guy? The trial was over, but the story was far from finished. The aftermath would see anger, recrimination, and painful reckonings, not only in the Guy family, but across a nation that had followed every detail. The murder of Scott Guy had gripped New Zealand. Now the acquittal of his brother-in-law ensured it would never let go. The verdict had been delivered, not guilty of murder. But the story didn't end there. Only days later, Ewen Macdonald returned to court, not to face accusations of killing Scott, but to be sentenced for the crimes he had already admitted to. These were the acts that had revealed his secret double life: burning down a house, smashing property with an axe, killing calves in the dead of night. Crimes of malice and destruction, hidden for years until the murder investigation dragged them into the light. The courtroom was quieter this time, the cameras fewer, the public less frenzied. But for those who gathered, the revelations were still shocking. Farmers, more than most, understand the bond between humans and animals. To hear that Macdonald had slaughtered calves with a hammer during a dispute with a neighbor was sickening. To know he had torched a home and vandalized property under cover of darkness made the man who had once seemed ordinary appear deeply sinister. The judge described Macdonald's behavior as calculated, cruel, and disturbing. He sentenced him to 5 years in prison for those crimes. Not for murder, the jury had acquitted him of that, but for the sabotage that had poisoned his community and shattered trust within his family. For some, the sentence felt like a consolation prize. For others, it was further proof of who Macdonald really was. Yet the contradiction remained. How could a man capable of such violence and deceit not also be guilty of murder? The question gnawed at the public, splitting opinion across the country. Inside the Guy family, the aftermath was even more devastating. Kylie, still raising Hunter and baby Drover without their father, was furious. To her, the jury had let Scott down. She believed Macdonald was guilty, no matter what the verdict said. In interviews after the trial, her voice trembled with frustration. Scott didn't get justice. Brian and Joe, Scott's parents, were torn in ways no parents should ever be. They grieved for their son, but they also had to reckon with the fact that their daughter's husband had been accused, tried, and acquitted of the murder. The pain fractured the family. Where once there had been unity, there was now silence, suspicion, and heartbreak. Anna stood by her husband. She clung to the verdict as proof of his innocence, insisting he was being unfairly vilified. To her, Ewen was not a murderer, but a man who had made terrible mistakes and was now paying the price. Yet her loyalty came at a cost. The gulf between her and Kylie widened into something almost impossible to bridge. And across New Zealand, the arguments continued. Some believed the jury had done its job, sticking to the principle that guilt must be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Others felt betrayed, convinced that justice had slipped away. Coffee shop conversations, talkback radio calls, and online forums burned with debate. Did the jury get it right, or had a killer just walked free? For the police, the outcome was a bitter pill. Operation Yellow had consumed more than a year of manpower, millions of dollars, and endless hours of investigation. Yet the one crime they most wanted to solve, the murder of Scott Guy, remained officially unsolved. No one else was charged. No new suspects emerged. The case was closed, but not resolved. And so the question lingered. For Kylie, for Brian and Joe, for the entire country. If not Ewen, then who? The verdict was supposed to provide answers. Instead, it left only more uncertainty, more pain, and a family scarred in ways that time could never fully heal. The trial was over. The cameras had packed up, the reporters moved on to other stories. But for the Guy family, life would never return to what it once was. The murder of Scott Guy had taken a son, a husband, a father, and a brother. The trial of Ewen Macdonald had then split the family in two. And the verdict, not guilty of murder, left wounds that no sentence, no explanation, and no verdict could heal. Kylie, now raising Hunter and baby Drover on her own, carried her grief like a shadow. She had sat through every day of the trial, relived the morning of Scott's death again and again, and listened to the prosecution build a case she believed in with every fiber of her being. The jury, she felt, had failed her husband. She said later that she felt robbed. Robbed not only of her husband's life but of justice. Her pain hardened into anger. She gave interviews where she spoke candidly, her voice shaking with emotion, Scott didn't get justice, she said. To her, the trial had been a cruel theater, the verdict a betrayal. And in her eyes, the man who should have been held accountable was the same man who had sat across from her at family dinners, who had carried her husband's coffin, who had hugged her in the hours after Scott's death. For Brian and Joe, the fracture was almost unbearable. They had lost their son, but their daughter Anna was still married to the man acquitted of killing him. To love one child meant sharing space with the spouse the Crown had accused. To stand with Kylie often meant standing against Anna. Family gatherings became impossible. Conversations ended in silence or in tears. What had once been a tightly bound farming family was now a family divided by suspicion, loyalty, and grief. Anna refused to waver. She stood by Ewen, visiting him in prison as he served time for the crimes he had admitted. She described him not as a murderer but as a man who had made mistakes. Terrible mistakes, yes, but not the one crime that mattered most. To Anna, the jury had spoken, and that was the truth. She told friends she believed her husband was innocent. But her loyalty to him deepened the chasm with her parents and her sister-in-law. Beyond the family, the case remained an open wound for the country. The media couldn't let it go. Even after the verdict, newspapers carried features, TV shows revisited the story, and documentaries retraced the trial. Every new detail, every leaked piece of evidence, every interview with a family member reignited debate. Talkback radio remained a battlefield. One caller insisting Macdonald was guilty, another saying he had been wrongly accused. On farms and in kitchens across New Zealand, the story lived on. People shook their heads at the brutality of the crime, argued over the evidence, and mourned the fact that no one had ever been held responsible for Scott's murder. The question, who killed Scott Guy, became less a mystery to solve and more a scar on the nation's conscience. For the police, the aftermath was grim. Their investigation had been exhaustive, but in the eyes of many, it had failed. Detectives admitted privately that they had no other suspects, no new leads, no alternative theory that could be proved in court. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, it was unfinished. And for the Guy family, the pain was relentless. Every milestone, Hunter's first day at school, Drover's first steps, birthdays, anniversaries, carried the heavy absence of the man who should have been there. Kylie carried on, strong for her children, but her life was forever marked by that winter morning in 2010. The farm, once the heart of the family, now felt more like a battlefield of ghosts. The cows were still milked, the land still worked, but the laughter and camaraderie that once filled the milking shed were gone. The story of Scott Guy had begun as a brutal murder. It had become a sensational trial. And now, in the aftermath, it had turned into something even more tragic. A family divided, a community scarred, and a country still searching for answers it might never find. The name Scott Guy was no longer just a memory. It had become a question, an unsolved riddle that lingered on the lips of an entire nation. Who killed Scott Guy? When the jury announced their not guilty verdict, the words were final in law, but in the court of public opinion, the debate was only beginning. In the days that followed, journalists scrambled to understand how 11 ordinary New Zealanders could have reached their decision. The answer lay in the principle that guided them, beyond reasonable doubt. Some jurors later spoke anonymously about the weight of their task. They admitted that Macdonald's secret crimes, the arson, the vandalism, the calf killings, had disturbed them deeply. But the judge had been clear: those acts were not proof of murder. The jury had to separate their disgust from their decision. And when they stripped the case back to its core, they saw too many gaps. The boot prints were circumstantial. The timeline was too tight. The absence of a weapon, an eyewitness, or a confession left the Crown's story incomplete. Suspicion, they concluded, wasn't enough. Yet for many outside the jury box, the reasoning was harder to accept. Newspapers ran headlines that captured the split. Justice or travesty? Opinion pieces criticized the police for narrowing their focus too quickly, for building a case on motive rather than hard evidence. Detectives defended their work, pointing out that they had pursued hundreds of leads, tested every theory, and still found the evidence circling back to Macdonald. But critics wondered, had the investigation been too tunnel-visioned? Had detectives overlooked other possibilities in their determination to pin the crime on Ewen? Forensic experts also came under scrutiny. The late discovery of a second shotgun would raised suspicions about how the scene had been managed. If such a crucial piece of evidence could appear days later, what else might have been missed? The defense had hammered that point, and now, in hindsight, the public questioned it too. In the community, the verdict left people uneasy. Feilding had once been a town where neighbors trusted one another, where gates were left open and farms shared equipment without hesitation. But after Scott's murder, suspicion seeped into the soil. Families locked doors at night, something they'd never done before. Whispers of theories circulated at rugby games, in farm supply stores, in the pub. Everyone had an opinion, but no one had an answer. The Guy family carried the heaviest burden. For Kylie, the verdict was a cruel denial of what she believed to be the truth. For Brian and Joe, the fracture between their daughters and their grief for their son created an impossible tension. And for Anna, loyalty to her husband put her at odds with her own family. Meanwhile, Ewen Macdonald sat in prison serving time for the crimes he had admitted. Crimes that painted him as destructive, secretive, and dangerous, even if not a murderer in the eyes of the law. Public opinion of him was merciless. In the court of gossip and media, acquittal did not equal innocence. His name was forever tied to the killing, whether proven or not. And through it all, the question refused to fade. The jury had answered one part: Ewen Macdonald was not guilty of murder. But they hadn't answered the part that mattered most to the family, the community, and the country. If not Ewen, then who? The silence that followed that question was perhaps the most haunting sound of all. By 2013, a year had passed since the trial of Ewen Macdonald. The verdict had been delivered, the sentencing for his other crimes completed. But the name Scott Guy still dominated headlines. The case refused to die because the central question, who killed Scott, remained unanswered. For the Guy family, life was a daily balancing act of grief, anger, and survival. Kylie, now a widow in her early 30s, carried the responsibility of raising Hunter and little Drover without their father. She appeared strong in public, determined to honor Scott's memory, but privately she was still raw. Every milestone in her children's lives was bittersweet. Hunter starting school, Drover learning his first words. Each joyful moment sharpened the ache of Scott's absence. Kylie was also painfully aware of the public gaze. She became a reluctant figure in New Zealand's national story, spoken about on talkback shows and dissected in newspaper columns. Some sympathized deeply with her, the young widow left behind. Others, cruelly, speculated about her role, questioning her every decision, as if grief itself needed to be explained. She bore it all quietly, but the burden was immense. For Brian and Joe Guy, the fracture in their family grew deeper with time. They still mourned their son every day, but they were also parents to Anna, who continued to stand by her husband. The verdict had freed Ewen of murder, but his reputation as an arsonist, vandal, and liar cast a long shadow. Family gatherings became impossible. To have Anna and Kylie in the same room was unthinkable. What had once been a tight-knit farming family now existed as fractured branches, barely speaking. Anna's loyalty to her husband never wavered. She visited him in prison, brought their children to see him, and held onto the belief that he was innocent of the murder. Her world, however, was no easier than Kylie's. She too was judged by the public, whispered about in supermarkets and on street corners. To some, she was the loyal wife who stood by her man. To others, she was the woman who had chosen her husband over her brother. Meanwhile, the farm itself became a symbol of the fracture. Once the heart of the Guy family, it was now a place haunted by absence. The cows were still milked, the land still plowed, but the laughter and partnership that had once filled the sheds were gone. Workers left. The atmosphere soured. What had once been a thriving family enterprise now felt heavy with bitterness. In the community, people carried on, but the murder had left a mark. Feilding, once known as the friendliest town in New Zealand, was now a place whispered about in connection with betrayal and violence. Outsiders drove past the farm, slowing down to glimpse the gates where Scott had fallen. For locals, the constant presence of journalists and strangers was an intrusion, a reminder of a wound they wanted to heal but couldn't. And then there was the media. Every anniversary of Scott's death brought fresh headlines. Documentaries were produced, talk shows revisited the case, and new books promised to unravel the mystery. Each time, the Guy family was dragged back into the spotlight. For Kylie, the retelling was agony, a reopening of wounds that had barely begun to scar. For Anna, each rehash of the trial was another round of whispers, another set of sideways glances. The police, meanwhile, remained silent. With no new suspects, no fresh leads, there was little more they could do. Operation Yellow was effectively over, even if the crime it set out to solve remained unsolved. Detectives admitted privately that the case haunted them. They had given everything to it, and still the killer walked free. By 2015, 5 years after Scott's death, the story had shifted from tragedy to enigma. New Zealanders remembered where they were when they heard the verdict. They still debated it in cafes, still argued about whether justice had been served. But the sharp edges of outrage began to dull into something sadder, more resigned. The nation had lived through the trial, the verdict, the media frenzy. But as the years passed, one truth became harder to ignore. The murder of Scott Guy might never be solved. For the family, that reality was unbearable. For the country, it was unsatisfying. And for the memory of Scott himself, it was unjust. By the mid to late 2010s, the murder of Scott Guy was no longer front-page news every day. But it never truly left the headlines. Like a wound that refused to close, the case resurfaced again and again, on anniversaries, in documentaries, in books, and in the endless churn of public debate. Every July, when the date of Scott's death came around, reporters returned to Feilding. They stood outside the gates of the farm, microphones in hand, asking the same questions. Has there been progress? Does the family still hope for justice? The answers were always the same. No new suspects, no arrests, only grief and frustration. Television networks produced long-form documentaries, repackaging the story for audiences who couldn't let it go. These programs replayed the timeline of Scott's final morning, dissected the evidence, and interviewed experts who debated whether the jury had been right. For viewers, it was gripping. For the Guy family, it was agony. Each broadcast meant their loss was not only personal but public, their private heartbreak dissected for ratings. Books also emerged, each one promising insight, each one reopening wounds. Some authors wrote with sympathy, capturing the human cost of the tragedy. Others focused on the sensational elements, the trial, the secret crimes of Ewen Macdonald, the fractures in the family. Each publication was another reminder that the case was not just theirs anymore. It belonged to the country. The public fascination was understandable. The case had everything that makes a story impossible to forget. A brutal killing in a quiet town, family turned against family, a high-profile trial, and a verdict that left the central question unanswered. But for those who lived it, Kylie, Brian, Joe, Anna, and the children, the fascination was a curse. Kylie especially bore the brunt of it. Every time a new article appeared, every time a documentary aired, strangers felt entitled to comment on her life. They debated her grief, her decisions, even her parenting. She wanted nothing more than to raise her boys in peace. But peace was impossible when the ghost of the trial followed her everywhere. Anna, too, carried her own burden. Her loyalty to Ewen was seen by some as admirable, by others as incomprehensible. Wherever she went, the whispers followed. The split between her and her family had not healed, and the constant return of media attention only widened the gap. For Brian and Joe, the repeated retellings meant reliving the loss of their son over and over. Each interview request forced them to choose between silence, which could look like indifference, or participation, which meant exposing their pain to the world yet again. And yet, even as the family suffered, the public hunger for answers never waned. Talkback radio shows could still fill hours with callers debating the case. Online forums dissected every piece of evidence, every courtroom detail, as if amateur sleuths might succeed where police had failed. But the truth remained stubbornly out of reach. The police had no new leads, no alternative suspects. The case file gathered dust in the archives of Operation Yellow, a reminder of both the scale of the effort and its ultimate futility. By the late 2010s, nearly a decade after Scott's death, one reality had settled over the story. The murder of Scott Guy was not only unsolved, it was likely to remain so. And yet, even in that uncertainty, the story endured. It was no longer just about a crime. It was about the questions it left behind, the family it broke apart, and the nation it unsettled. For some, Scott Guy's murder had become a symbol of justice unfulfilled. For others, it was a haunting mystery that demanded resolution. For his family, it was simply the absence of a husband, a father, and a son. A void that no verdict, no documentary, no book could ever fill. For Kylie Guy, the morning of July 8, 2010, never ended. Life moved on for others. The trial came and went, headlines faded, anniversaries passed. But for her, that winter dawn remained frozen in time. The knock on the door, the words that Scott had been killed, the world collapsing in an instant. In the years that followed, Kylie learned to live with a kind of grief that had no cure. She was in her early 30s, a mother of two, suddenly alone. Hunter was just a toddler when Scott died. Drover was an infant. Neither would grow up with memories of their father. That truth haunted her more than anything. She fought to give her boys a normal life. She wanted them to know who Scott had been. His laugh, his generosity, his love of farming. The way he would lift Hunter onto his shoulders or rock Drover to sleep. She told them stories, showed them photos, and kept his memory alive in their home. But behind the strength she showed her sons, the pain was constant. The trial only deepened the wound. Sitting in court, listening to the Crown describe how Scott had been ambushed and executed, forced her to relive the horror again and again. Hearing the defense argue that the evidence wasn't enough, that the crime might never be solved, filled her with helpless rage. When the verdict came back not guilty, she felt as though Scott had been failed a second time, first by his killer, then by the justice system. Kylie spoke about it later, her voice shaking. Scott didn't get justice. Those words became her refrain, a truth she carried with her. Beyond the grief and anger, there was also the suffocating glare of public attention. Overnight, Kylie had become a symbol, the young widow at the center of New Zealand's most gripping trial. Strangers stopped her in the street, offered condolences, sometimes advice. Others were cruel, speculating about her grief, dissecting her private life as though it were public property. She bore it all quietly, refusing to let the world see her break. But behind closed doors, she wrestled with loneliness. Raising two boys alone was exhausting. Nights were the hardest. The silence of the house, the empty space where Scott should have been, the weight of decisions she now had to make by herself. Still, Kylie pushed forward. She built a life for Hunter and Drover, determined that their father's murder would not define them. She enrolled them in school, encouraged their interests, surrounded them with family and friends who would help carry the load. She made sure they grew up knowing not the tragedy of their father's death, but the love of his life. Yet even as the years passed, Scott's absence was everywhere. Birthdays, Christmas mornings, Father's Day, all were reminders of what had been stolen. Kylie described the grief as something that never left her, only changed shape. She also carried the unique burden of a fractured family. For her, Ewen Macdonald's acquittal was not a relief but an injustice. And Anna's loyalty to her husband was a wound she couldn't reconcile. Family gatherings became impossible. The sense of unity the guys had once shared was gone. and Kylie often found herself isolated from those who had once been her closest support. Through it all, she never stopped hoping for answers. Even years after the trial, she would say she wanted the truth. For her sons, for Scott. But as time passed, hope grew quieter, and reality set in. The case might never be solved. And so Kylie carried on, not with closure, but with resilience. Her life became about survival, about protecting her boys, about keeping Scott's memory alive even as the world moved further from the day he was lost. For New Zealand, she remained the face of the tragedy, the widow left behind. But for Hunter and Drover, she was something much more important. The mother who never let grief define their future, even as it shaped her own every single day. If Kylie was the face of grief, Anna Macdonald was the face of conflict. She had lost her brother, but the man accused of killing him was also her husband, the father of her children, the partner she had built a life with. When the police arrested Ewen Macdonald in 2011, Anna's world was shattered. The man she knew, the father who tucked their kids into bed, the husband who worked alongside her on the farm, was suddenly painted as a cold-blooded killer. The shock rippled not just through her, but through the entire Guy family. For Anna, the trial was unbearable. Day after day, she sat in the courtroom, hearing the Crown argue that her husband had ambushed and murdered her brother. She listened as the defense insisted the evidence was weak, that Ewen was not the man the Crown described. She saw the photographs, the diagrams, the forensic reports, and through it all, she clung to her belief that Ewen could not have killed Scott. When the jury delivered its verdict, not guilty, Anna felt relief, but it was a hollow kind. Her husband was acquitted, but the price was devastating. The verdict had not united the family. It had divided it beyond repair. Her loyalty to Ewen came at a cost. For Kylie, her sister-in-law's loyalty felt like betrayal. Kylie believed Ewen was guilty. Anna believed he was not. The divide was absolute. There was no middle ground, no compromise. Family gatherings ended. Conversations dried up. Where once the Guy family had been tightly knit, now there was only silence. Anna's position in the public eye was no easier. To some, she was a loyal wife, standing by her husband in the darkest of times. To others, she was blind, refusing to see what they believed was the truth. The whispers followed her everywhere. In supermarkets, in church, at school pickups. Strangers debated her marriage, her choices, her loyalty, as though she were a character in a play rather than a woman living through unimaginable pain. When Ewen was sentenced to prison for the other crimes, the arson, the vandalism, the killing of calves, Anna's loyalty did not falter. She visited him, brought their children to see him, and insisted he was paying the price for his mistakes but not for murder. For her, the jury's verdict had been clear. He had not killed Scott. She held onto that truth, even when it placed her on the opposite side of her grieving parents and her widowed sister-in-law. But the cost of loyalty was heavy. Anna was effectively estranged from much of her family. The farm, once a shared home, was no longer a place of unity. Holidays were fractured, conversations strained. She was left walking a lonely path, torn between her roles as daughter, sister, wife, and mother. For the public, Anna's story was one of the most heartbreaking elements of the case. She was caught in an impossible position, a woman forced to choose between the family she was born into and the family she had built. Her choice was clear. She stood by her husband. But in doing so, she lost much of the family she had once relied on. Years later, Anna rarely spoke publicly. When she did, her words were measured. She defended Ewen, insisted he was not a murderer, and expressed her pain at being estranged from her family. But behind the words was a woman carrying a burden few could comprehend. The tragedy of Scott Guy's murder was not only the loss of his life. It was also the destruction of the family he left behind. And in that destruction, Anna's story was perhaps the most agonizing of all. A sister who lost her brother, a wife who stood by her husband, and a daughter caught in the middle of a family torn apart. For Brian and Joe Guy, the murder of their son was the kind of loss no parent should ever endure. On the morning of July 8, 2010, they learned that Scott, The boy they had raised on the family farm, the young man who had grown into a father himself, had been gunned down at his own gate. From that moment on, their lives were defined by grief. Scott had been more than a son. He was the one who had carried on the family tradition of farming, the one who seemed destined to inherit the land that had been in the Guy name for generations. Brian and Joe had watched with pride as he built a life with Kylie, as he became a father to Hunter and Drover, as he dreamed of shaping the farm into a place his children would one day call home. All of that ended in a blast of shotgun fire. In the early days, their grief was compounded by shock. The police moved quickly, and when they arrested Ewen Macdonald, their son-in-law, the foundation of the family crumbled. How could the man married to their daughter, the man they had welcomed into their family, trusted with their land, and loved like a son, now be accused of murdering their boy? The trial was a torment for them. Every day they sat in the courtroom, torn in two. On one side was Kylie, their grieving daughter-in-law, convinced that justice meant convicting Ewen. On the other was Anna, their daughter, clinging to her husband's innocence. Brian and Joe were parents to both, and every look, every word, carried the weight of divided loyalties. When the verdict came back not guilty, their world fractured further. They had hoped for closure, some kind of answer to ease their pain. Instead, they were left with uncertainty. The son they had lost was still gone, and the question of who killed him remained unanswered. Worse still, the verdict deepened the split between their daughters. As parents, they were placed in an impossible position. How could they comfort Kylie, who believed her husband's killer had walked free, while also supporting Anna, who stood by the man the jury had acquitted? Their grief was compounded by helplessness. They could not fix what had been broken. In the years that followed, Brian and Joe tried to hold on to what remained. They supported Kylie as she raised Hunter and Drover. They also remained in contact with Anna, though the relationship was strained and awkward. Holidays became fractured. Family gatherings that had once been warm and noisy were now small, heavy with absences. For Joe especially, the loss of unity was almost as painful as the loss of her son. She had always been the heart of the family, the one who nurtured and held everyone together. Now she lived with the knowledge that her family was broken beyond repair. In public, Brian and Joe were dignified. They gave interviews, spoke of their love for Scott, and expressed gratitude for the support of the community. But behind closed doors, the grief never lessened. Friends who knew them well said the sparkle was gone from their eyes, the weight of sorrow etched into their faces. The murder of Scott Guy had taken one son from them. The trial had then taken the unity of the rest of their family. For Brian and Joe, it was not one tragedy, but two. And perhaps the cruelest part of all was the uncertainty. If Ewen wasn't guilty, then who was? That question haunted them. It haunted every empty chair at the dinner table, every birthday Scott never celebrated, every milestone his boys reached without him. For Brian and Joe, there would never be a day without grief. Only days when the grief was quieter, less raw, more hidden from view. Theirs was the story of parents who had lost everything: a son, a united family, and the peace of knowing the truth. From the moment Scott Guy was killed, his story belonged not just to his family but to the country. What began as a brutal murder in rural Feilding became one of New Zealand's most watched trials, and one of its most divisive verdicts. In small towns and big cities alike, people argued about the case. In cafes, workplaces, and farm supply stores, the same question was debated. Did Ewen Macdonald get away with murder, or was he an innocent man wrongly accused? The trial had laid bare the fragility of justice. For many, the jury's verdict highlighted the gulf between suspicion and proof. It was a stark reminder that the courtroom does not deal in hunches or gut feelings. It deals in evidence. And if the evidence isn't watertight, the law demands acquittal. Some admired the jury for sticking to that principle. They pointed out that it would be far worse to convict a man on shaky grounds than to let him go free. The phrase, "beyond reasonable doubt," became a rallying cry for those who defended the verdict. But others were outraged. To them, the circumstantial evidence painted a clear picture of guilt. They couldn't accept that a man who admitted to arson, vandalism, and killing calves could be innocent of the one crime that mattered most. They believed the jury had been fooled, or that the system had failed. Talkback radio lit up with callers, each convinced they knew the truth. Newspapers ran editorial after editorial, weighing the strengths and weaknesses of the case. Television debates revisited the trial months after it ended. The murder of Scott Guy wasn't just news, it was a national obsession. And beneath the debate was something deeper: fear. If a man could be ambushed and killed at his farm gate in a small, safe town like Feilding, then nowhere was truly safe. If the police could pour thousands of hours into a case and still fail to secure a conviction, then justice was fragile. If a family could be torn apart so completely, then what did that mean for the rest of us? The case became a mirror for the country. It revealed how we view loyalty and betrayal, how we judge the accused, how we weigh evidence, and how we respond when the law leaves us unsatisfied. It also sparked conversations about farming life, succession, and family conflict. Many farming families across New Zealand recognized themselves in the Guy story. The tensions between brothers, the unspoken rivalries, the heavy weight of inheritance. The murder may have been extreme, but the pressures that led up to it were familiar to many. Above all, the case left the nation uneasy. It wasn't just that Scott's murder was unsolved. It was that the story had no resolution, no justice for the victim, no closure for the family, no certainty for the community. Years later, people still remembered where they were when the verdict came down. They still debated it, still argued about whether justice had been done. In the public imagination, the case never truly ended. For New Zealand, the murder of Scott Guy became more than a crime. It became a question, one that lingered long after the courtroom doors closed. What does justice mean when the truth is out of reach? Time is meant to heal, but in the case of Scott Guy's murder, time only ensured that the wound was reopened again and again. Every year, July 8th arrived like a dark shadow. On the anniversary of Scott's death, the media returned to Feilding. Reporters stood at the farm gates with their cameras, revisiting the same story, asking the same questions. The headlines shifted slightly from year to year, 5 years on, a decade on. Still no justice. But the theme never changed. The case was unsolved, the family still grieving, the killer still unknown. For the Guy family, these anniversaries were torment. While others marked the date with headlines and news bulletins, they lived it every day. For Kylie, it meant explaining to her sons once again why their father wasn't there, why the world still spoke his name. For Brian and Joe, it meant sitting through yet another round of media requests, deciding whether to stay silent or speak, knowing that either choice carried pain. For Anna, it meant seeing her family's heartbreak replayed, while she tried to protect her children from the fallout of their father's infamy. Television networks, too, kept the case alive. Special documentaries re-examined the evidence, some featuring reenactments of the murder, others interviewing experts who dissected the police investigation. The programs were polished, dramatic, and popular. Audiences wanted answers. But for the family, each broadcast was a brutal reminder of a story they could never escape. Books and long-form journalism added to the cycle. Authors returned to the case, promising fresh insight, though the facts remained the same. Some delved into Ewen's secret crimes, painting him as a man capable of far darker deeds. Others focused on the family fracture, portraying the Guy household as a symbol of how tragedy can destroy what once seemed unbreakable. And then there was the speculation. Online forums hummed with theories. Armchair detectives picked apart the trial transcripts, convinced they could see what the jury missed. Some suggested alternative suspects. Others clung to the belief that Ewen was guilty despite his acquittal. The internet gave the case new life, ensuring it stayed alive long after the newspapers had moved on. For the community of Feilding, the constant retelling was exhausting. What had once been a close-knit, cheerful town was now indelibly linked to murder. Locals grew weary of the media presence, of strangers driving past the farm, of outsiders defining their town by a tragedy they wanted to leave behind. Yet even they couldn't fully turn away. The case was a part of them too. Through it all, the silence from police grew louder. Detectives had followed every lead, exhausted every possibility. With no weapon, no confession, and no new evidence, the trail had gone cold. Officially, the file remained open. Unofficially, there was little more that could be done. As the years passed, the story evolved from a breaking news tragedy into something else, a national mystery. It joined the ranks of unsolved cases that linger in a country's memory, the kind that parents warn their children about, the kind that storytellers and journalists revisit when anniversaries demand it. And yet, beneath the speculation, the documentaries, and the endless retellings, one truth never changed. For the Guy family, Scott was not a mystery. He was a husband, a father, a son, a brother. His murder wasn't a story. It was a hole in their lives that nothing could fill. The rest of the country might have treated his death as a case, a puzzle, or a debate. But for those who loved him, every retelling was simply another reminder of what they had lost, and what they had never found. When Scott Guy was murdered, his sons were far too young to understand what had happened. Hunter was just a toddler, old enough to know his dad had been there one day and gone the next. Drover was still a baby, too young even to remember his father's voice. For their mother, Kylie, the hardest part of grief was watching her boys grow up without the man who had loved them so deeply. She tried to fill the silence with stories. The way Scott would lift Hunter high onto his shoulders, how he talked excitedly about teaching them both to ride motorbikes and work on the farm. She kept photographs, told bedtime stories, made sure her children knew who their father was, even if they couldn't remember him themselves. But Kylie also knew her sons were growing up in the shadow of something bigger than their father's memory. Their family's tragedy was national news. As they grew older, they would hear Scott's name spoken not just at home, but in documentaries, in classrooms, in the media. They would see his face not only in family albums but on TV screens. Kylie worked hard to give them as normal a childhood as possible. School, sports, birthdays, friends. She wanted them to have what every child deserved. But the weight of their father's story was always there, an invisible presence shaping the way others saw them and the way they saw themselves. On the other side of the fractured family were Ewen and Anna's children. For them, the tragedy was no less complicated. Their father had been accused of killing their uncle. He had been acquitted, but he was still branded by the crimes he admitted to: arson, vandalism, cruelty to animals. For years, he served time in prison, and they grew up visiting him behind glass, learning to love a man the country condemned. Anna tried to shield them from the worst of it. She insisted that their father was not a murderer, that the jury had cleared him, that he was paying the price for mistakes but not for Scott's death. Still, whispers followed them just as they followed her. Children can be cruel, and in a small town, nothing stays secret for long. Both sets of children grew up carrying legacies they hadn't chosen. For Hunter and Drover, it was the legacy of absence. A father taken too soon, a story of loss that defined their earliest years. For Anna's children, it was the legacy of loyalty. Growing up with a father who was both loved and condemned, defended at home but doubted by the world. As the years passed, all of them would reach an age where the case was no longer just a family story but a history they were part of. They would learn how their family had been torn apart, how the country had debated their futures long before they could speak for themselves. And yet, within the tragedy, there was resilience. Hunter and Drover grew surrounded by a mother who loved them fiercely, grandparents who supported them, and a community that, despite its fascination with the case, also cared for them. Ewen and Anna's children grew with a mother who fought to keep their world steady, even as everything around them cracked. The children's lives remind us of something important. Behind every crime, every trial, every headline, are those who grow up in its aftermath. They inherit not just the love of those who protect them, but also the shadows of what was lost. For the next generation of the Guy and Macdonald families, the story of Scott's murder was not just history. It was the backdrop of their lives, a shadow they did not ask for, but one they will carry forever. The story of Scott Guy began on a cold July morning in 2010, but it has never truly ended. More than a decade later, his murder remains one of New Zealand's most haunting unsolved crimes. A tragedy that left a family broken, a community scarred, and a nation full of questions. Scott's life was not defined by the way it ended. He was a young man in love with the land he worked, a devoted husband, a proud father who dreamed of raising his boys on the same soil where he had grown up. He had flaws, as all people do, but he was kind, generous, and full of plans for the future. Those who knew him remember his laugh, his easy smile, and the way he threw himself into life. That is the Scott his family carries in their hearts. But the manner of his death, ambushed at his own farm gate, killed without warning, transformed his story into something larger, something tragic, something unresolved. The trial of Ewen Macdonald gave the nation a front-row seat to the unraveling of a family. Brothers turned rivals, sisters divided, parents forced to choose between children. A jury asked to weigh not only evidence but the possibility of betrayal within a household that had once seemed unshakable. When the verdict came, not guilty, there was no relief, no peace. The Guy family was left with more questions than answers. Kylie, widowed and raising 2 boys alone, felt justice had slipped through her fingers. Anna, loyal to her husband, stood apart, estranged from the family she was born into. Brian and Joe, parents of both Scott and Anna, lived with the unbearable weight of grief and division. And beyond the family, the country wrestled with its own questions. Could justice ever be found when proof was elusive? Could a community ever feel safe again when a murder went unsolved? Could a family ever recover from such a rupture? Over the years, the case has refused to fade. Documentaries, books, and news features kept the story alive. Each anniversary brought fresh headlines. Each retelling reopened wounds. For the family, there was no moving on. For the public, there was no forgetting. Scott Guy's murder is now part of New Zealand's collective memory. It is spoken of alongside other tragedies that defy closure, the kind of story that lingers in the national consciousness not because it is solved, but because it is not. The truth may never be known. The person who pulled the trigger that morning remains unnamed, unpunished. The case file still exists, open in theory, but silent in reality. What endures is not resolution, but legacy. The legacy of a young father taken too soon. The legacy of children growing up in the shadow of a crime they did not choose. The legacy of a family once united, now divided by grief and doubt. And the legacy of a nation reminded that justice is not always certain, and closure is not always possible. But amid the sorrow, there is also resilience. Kylie carried on for Hunter and Drover, raising them with love and determination. Anna protected her children and stood by her choices, however painful. Brian and Joe bore their grief with quiet dignity. And the wider community, though shaken, held on to the memory of Scott not as a victim, but as a man who was loved, who gave love, and who deserved far more years than he was given. Scott Guy's story is not just about a crime. It is about love and loss, loyalty and betrayal, resilience and despair. It is about the questions we ask when justice fails us, and the lives that continue in the shadow of those questions. And though the case may remain unsolved, one truth endures. Scott's life mattered. His memory endures, and his story will never be forgotten.